morning disclosure conference. My name's Brianne Boland. I have been a full-stack engineer, an infrastructure engineer, an SRE, and now I'm an application security engineer. Yes, there's a lot of transition in that sentence. For my current job, I was referred by a friend who thought of me when the team mentioned that they'd like a little ops up in their security practice. For the sake of a little extra humanity, I'll also tell you that I write a lot, both for work and not, and in the before times, this is where I'd mention something about liking to travel. Instead, I'll tell you that my hobbies include being in my house and sometimes not being in my house when I feel fancy. I'm also the 2-time undefeated DEF CON Spelling Bee Championship. I had hoped to get to defend it this summer, but, maybe I'll see you in 2021. To start, though, let me take you back to my last job. Being an SRE was a blast. I provisioned servers, I monitored the fleet, I wrote internal tools, and I helped devs learn about making the AWS resources they needed for their projects. My favorite part, though, was figuring out exactly how my team was enigmatic to the rest of the company and creating regular meetings and docs to explain just what it was we, did there. And yes, I've been on call. I know the glittering, effervescent feeling of deleting PagerDuty off my phone. If you've never tried it, I recommend it. It's a great high. So if I loved being an SRE, why did I switch jobs? I asked myself the same question after this opportunity came up. I've been interested in security for several years, since shortly after I became an engineer. And then after years of going to DEF CON, obligatory sigh, and local security meetups and pursuing education and all of the stuff that I could find, and then using it to augment my ops work, a pretty unparalleled opportunity arose and I leapt at it. I do miss my SRE work, but even still, no regrets. It's wonderful to look at things from the other side, and it's been a great complement to my existing knowledge. First, though, I want to tell you a little bit about how ops and sec work are similar and then where they diverge hard. Technically, of course, there is overlap between the two jobs. It would have been hard for me to get my current job if there wasn't. However, I also think you can't be a very effective ops engineer if you aren't at least somewhat versed in basic security practices. Otherwise, you'd just be spinning up tons of vulnerable servers out there just inviting trouble. Beyond that, though, I found a lot of philosophical similarities. Things that let me be more effective at this new job because of my SRE experience in ways I didn't expect. Let me tell you a story that happened in the later days of my last job. A coworker asked me to help them out with a confusing command line error when they were trying to run an AWS CLI command. It turned out to be a credential issue. This was their first time using the AWS CLI, and I realized that because of some small differences between roles across our different parts of the company, both of which contained engineers, the onboarding docs they were provided on their first day didn't include the steps to set up those credentials. Note number 1. Brianne should go fix that and ensure that any engineer goes through that step in their first 2 days on the job, regardless of what team they're on. That day, though, I sat next to them, and I worked with them to get credentials and MFA set up with AWS. But when it came time to create a password for the console, I watched them think for a moment. Do you know that look? Because I do. It's the external aspect of an internal conversation called, which of my mental password library shall I use for this situation? And I'm guilty of doing it in the past, too. This was one of the many reasons that we required MFA for AWS logins, but still, oh no. I spoke very carefully, and I asked if they had set up 1Password as part of their onboarding. And if not, clearly I had another note. Brianne should go review the engineering onboarding docs and find out what let this fall through the cracks. It turned out that they had set it up, but that the docs didn't go beyond that to describe how we wanted it to actually be used. Instead, it stopped at, "You put this program on your work computer, great job." Unfortunately, it didn't follow up with how folks were supposed to use it in the course of their work. Instead, we'd assumed that everyone used a password keeper in their regular life, obviously, and they would just get it and integrate it into their workflows at our company. We didn't explain the reason we wanted people to use it, and instead we put it in the middle of several dozen setup tasks in the first couple of days of a new job. When we're all definitely at our best and definitely not completely overloaded with new people, new processes, and new bathroom locations. Oops. And that became note number 2. Explain the why for the thing we required of everyone. Because if we weren't requiring specific 1Password experience on hiring, and we were not, and we shouldn't have been, then it's reasonable to expect that we'll train people on the tools that we want them to use, so that they'll know what to do with this product we foist on them during a process that involves a lot of having products foisted on new people. I realized, in talking to this coworker, that the best outcome from this conversation, beyond guiding them toward adopting single-use passwords, was twofold. First was to ensure that nothing about how I conducted myself in this conversation gave my coworker or anyone they told about it any reason to want to avoid me or my team, or to hide other behavior that would raise security concerns for fear of jarring reactions. The second was that we very clearly, very badly needed to reevaluate our education around 1Password and how the company used it in our onboarding and the documentation, because it was failing our coworkers and introducing avoidable risk. This experience, along with all the education I'd been pursuing around AppSec and InfoSec and the like for previous years, might be the clearest, most specific link between being in ops and being in security for me. Both jobs require people to constantly bridge desired behavior and actual behavior. And both jobs, if you do them correctly, require a very careful approach to do right. You can have some success with the brute force approach, but, like with rate limiting on a login page, you're going to limit your own success. So tragically, for reasons that will soon become clear, I don't have a picture of what I'm about to describe to you, but let me paint a picture for you. The year is 2018. I have volunteered with the Packet Hacking Village at DEF CON. I've never volunteered with them before, and I don't have experience with the more involved running of the place, so I become the person at the info table at the front, the slightly less dark and loud part of a very dark and loud room. Everyone else working there has hacker names on their name tags. I have never really bothered with this, and actually still don't, so my name tag just says Brienne. I am wearing fuchsia tights, sparkly boots, and a gray A-line dress printed with unicorns. I am the first point of contact for the brave uninitiated who straggle in. Lit from below in a conference space that is dark except for puddles of light around the different activity tables, swathed in the oonts music coming from the DJ in the corner. Curious people come in with wide eyes and the rigid posture of anxiety, and they bellow, What's going on in here? I smile broadly and say, this room is amazing, and you can learn so much in here if you want. Here's what's going on. This is my approach to security, even now that I'm in a security org of more than 1,000 people. The approach is broadly the opposite of feigning surprise. Convert, oh, whoa, you don't know about this? To, oh, whoa, I get to tell you about this thing? I think you're going to love this, and it's going to make your life so much easier. Strap in. My team at work is not misanthropic, and it's part of why I accepted the job. We have people from a lot of different backgrounds and different lengths of tenure at the company. And the thing we all have in common is that we like making things better. And we like when people walk away from us having learned something more than, oh, that team said yes or no. I wonder sometimes if I would have found a place for myself in this field if I'd shown up 10 years earlier. I can't know, so instead I'm grateful that there's a place now, and that I found a team full of people for whom this approach is just common sense. But there's more overlap than just dispositions and reputation. So yeah, I spent some time over the last few years collecting job descriptions, first for ops jobs and then later for security ones. And these are the most common things that I found listed for both SRE and AppSec jobs. SRE is about like you'd expect. You have some Linux skills, you can do some shell scripting in 1 or 2 languages, little networking knowledge, familiarity with the cloud, whereas AppSec tends, of course, to have a focus on the OWASP top 10 and knowledge of secure coding and hacker mindset, the ability to break things, but also just to make them just a little bit safer whenever you can. And there are, of course, also technical elements that span both. In my case, I've found that to be code review skills, port hygiene knowledge, understanding the concepts of rate limiting and load balancing and what they can get for you, log and console output interpretation, and terminal abilities. But here's what I think is the good stuff, the things that I think actually make me good at both jobs. And the reasons I think that it makes sense to hire me, and certain other people, are the ability to write good docs, but also knowing when writing yet another doc and filing it away isn't actually the solution to the problem. The ability to listen well enough to start diagnosing the actual issue rather than running with what it kind of sounded like initially. The ability, of course, to keep a poker face when being told about alarming things. Fostering an atmosphere of psychological safety both within the team and without. And a good dose of gallows humor, just not too corrosive. So with that, let's talk about some technical things from my last job that made doing AppSec easier. First, let's talk about code review. So what does code review mean as an ops person? It was answering a few simple questions. Does it work? What exactly did you intend here? Which was usually said directly to the person sitting next to me because I was at a much smaller company and also we used to have offices. Is it commented enough to not be impossible later? That was one of my favorites. And then, no? Cool, ship it. How an AppSec person interacts with code is a little bit different. It's not unlike handling nuclear material. We need this, and also it might kill us all. In my last job, I absolutely saw things that I would stop the car over now. A nice little bash line that says eval and then a random argument from the command line, anyone? But we aren't paid to be all things at all times, and I was being paid to be an ops person, and we wanted the car to move forward in a fairly reliable way. That was our job. This is all to say, I have been the one who writes code of questionable security, though I will note that it got the job done that day. I maintain that this experience and the empathy I gained from it make me a better, more compassionate code reviewer. In job descriptions and other wish lists for future hires, tool and role familiarity are more often presented as a list of technologies or processes on a resume. But what I find really useful about the knowledge represented that way, beyond not having to learn everything from scratch in a new job, is that it lets you better understand the people you're talking to. I find it useful to approach security less from a standpoint of, what is this thing you did, my God? And more from, first let me figure out why you approached this the way you did. From there we can understand everything. Because there are absolutely lines of code I either wrote or approved in that job that would be process stoppers now, were I reviewing them in my current role. But I was correct to both write and approve them then because the goal was different. In my last job, it absolutely happened that I would need to update a script and would find something questionable in some under-commented bash file that my manager wrote 3 years prior when he was the only member of the team. It would feel funny, but it wasn't why I was in that file. Oh well. Meaning, I was fully aware of what I was doing, but there was a certain kind of yeehaw to doing it. Now I'm aware and I don't yeehaw so much. I just find it in other people's code and gently guide them to better practice. Yeehaw makes coding fun, but it's also a great thing to get out and review, whether that's in a pull request, a security review, or whatever. Murdering your darlings, it isn't just for pros. My own yeehaw experience means that I can empathize with people who just enjoy getting the job done. And now my security experience means that I can guide them towards something more sustainable and secure and approach it as a fun collaboration that will teach us both something. To know that two wildly different approaches, when faced with the same code, can both be entirely correct is what I think makes a security engineer more nimble, useful, and less painful to work with, too. So when I'm reviewing code, whenever it's possible, I put myself in the mindset of the person who wrote it. Unless the solution is obvious, this does not have a permissions check, it should have a permissions check, so you're going to go add a permissions check, right? Something like that. I don't like laying the big no on code choices without making it very clear what would pass my review the next time. Unfortunately, my code experience is varied enough that I can usually reasonably guess why someone made the choice they did. People really do sometimes just do the lazy thing. Good programmers should have a lazy streak after all. But most people are generally well-intentioned, and most people don't actually like producing shoddy work. So if someone makes a choice that's a clear violation of my team's secure code guidelines, not sanitizing input that goes directly into a SQL query, for instance, I don't consider my review done until I'm able to guide them toward a better solution. This is wrong as an incomplete answer. I prefer something with a reference and a little more detail so that they know how to do something differently next time and have the chance to do their job better. I'm not fully immersed in their context, so I don't always have the full situational knowledge that lets me land on the best solution for them. However, I do believe it's my job to tell them everything I know about their context, and to ensure they don't waste time on a different approach that I could have told them wasn't going to pass our review next time if I'd just taken the time to discuss things with them. It absolutely happens that people have to interact with my team more than once, sometimes even 3 or more times, although it's rare. However, it's absolutely my job to minimize that as much as I reasonably can. And part of that means understanding why people make the choice they did, so I can send them to the revision stage without feeling underinformed and like they're tilting at a windmill in the dark. Let's talk attack surfaces, though. I used to defend servers. I was also provisioning them, arguing with them, occasionally vowing vengeance against them, and otherwise having a rich frenemy-style relationship, but a large part of what I did was defending them. What's the best way to winnow down access to only the necessary ports and processes? What needs to be public-facing, and what can only be internally available? Along with ensuring that our developers had what they needed to do their work and for the company to continue doing business, I did a lot with IAM security groups and all that good stuff, which incidentally was great to talk about in a security interview. Coming out of my job with strong feelings and good examples about enforcing the principle of least privilege was really helpful. But now I defend everything. And I've gotten much better versed in the particular threat that comes in the way of a browser and what a user does with it. Just as at least some servers need to be accessible via the open internet, people need to be able to, use their browsers. To find information, to pass sensitive information along like credit card numbers, to access accounts, to safely look up high-quality goat GIFs. When it's computers talking to computers, there are still gray areas, but they're smaller. It's a binary medium, after all. Do you need it or not? But now I need to tell my colleagues, who are highly qualified professionals who know their jobs and needs well, that they can't use all the tools they want. And I have to explain why and balance their professed business needs with my team's ongoing needs of, not introducing bad actors into our private space. I used to have to explain to devs why certain software couldn't be used, why requested access couldn't be granted, and generally why it was my job to puncture their dreams of tech brilliance. Now I need to explain to coworkers why the Chrome extension that would cut an hour off of a common task can only be used if they talk to the company and get them to change permissions so that they can't, say, read and change all data in our internal sites. Threat modeling isn't just for security people. It's just security people who think to call it what it is more consistently. And having people on your AppSec team who have done it in a variety of situations is only going to make your team stronger. Incidentally, this is also a great argument for ensuring you have lots of different kinds of people on your team. Just trust that people who understand the evolving threats in a variety of situations are people who will think around corners you didn't even know were there. Let's talk about JavaScript, though. I used to have much stronger feelings about JavaScript. But I promise I've come around. Among other things, I've learned that insulting tools while ignoring context is actually a destructive behavior. True story, though. One of the reasons I took a hard turn toward infrastructure at one point was because I worked at a consultancy and did a stint as a full-stack engineer, like I mentioned earlier. One of our tools was Redux. Now I can say, absolutely, for me, Redux, never again. React, you're cool, you can stay, but Redux, This was also for a while one of the fast ways I'd establish a rapport with other infrastructure people when I was still a consultant. It was a quick way to find common ground. I don't usually like to lead with haterade for the sake of rapport, but alright, I can't lie, it was fun. And doing this job right in a sustainable and long-term way has meant dropping that practice. It's funny, but I wouldn't call it useful or even precisely true at this point. This goes back to the compassion thing. People pick tools for reasons. Tools remain in use because they're useful. And insulting tools, unless you acknowledge why it's still in use, it's just taking up airspace for no reason. I've come to the same place with JavaScript, and that's not only because I now have to read it regularly for work. It's also because I have to regularly read it for work. It's a bad sport, related to the equally bad sport of insulting front-end centered engineers, to make fun of JavaScript. Is it a mess? Sure, some versions of it are still rough. It was banged out fast and has been altered and built upon constantly since. Because we need it. I know, I'm sorry, but we need it. And we need to be able to make it secure, which means taking it seriously. Deciding to be a benevolent ops person meant I had to stop worrying and love the JavaScript. Is it, at its heart, a weakly typed mechanical bull that sometimes seems like it exists only to drop vulnerabilities across the internet? Totally. Is it our weakly typed mechanical bull? It sure is. And we do more with things if we embrace them than if we just make fun of things without putting any real effort in to improve them. Like, setting up some useful automation. I was given advice, good advice, a few years ago when I was still in infrastructure. My manager told me when I was in the middle of an unavoidably frustrating client engagement to try to automate myself out of a job. You'll never succeed, he said, but you'll make things less annoying for yourself in the meantime. It was great advice, which I followed religiously until roughly when I got my current job. Ops can and absolutely should automate all the things. It's a great approach. Application security, though, in the particular way that my team practices it, it does better with an approach that's more like, automate a certain selection of the things, but remember that part of the job is always talking to people directly and meeting them as a human. The distinction I've come to realize is figuring out what automation is reducing toil and what automation would unhelpfully remove a human from the situation. Good programmers are a little lazy, but security is one specialty where speaking directly to people is actually a shortcut sometimes. We deal in HTTP requests and server-client communication and all things computers, but a huge chunk of the job is dealing with people and understanding what's actually happening. Does a human need to read all the code to find every vulnerability? Do we gain some bespoke sense of security by not running some of the shinier automatic parts of Burp Suite? No, of course not. But it's a curious thing in security that relying too much on tools obscures problems sometimes rather than finding or preventing them. It varies by what aspects of security are part of your job, but I've been surprised at how many themes of upcoming trouble I've found just in the last 9 months by engaging in regular meetings with people. Going back to that unavoidably frustrating client engagement before I got into tech, I was, it turns out, already somewhat tech-minded because I was very meeting avoidant. A couple of jobs before I became an engineer, I burned a fair amount of capital by announcing that I was no longer accepting meetings without an agenda. It was a useful fire, though, because the culture of the company resulted in bloated meetings where people would be invited for an hour, even though their work was maybe only 5 minutes of that meeting. It was around this time that I became acutely aware of my own mortality, and I realized I couldn't do this anymore. So I began declining invitations without at least a 3-point agenda attached, because I couldn't keep going along with the cultural idea that attending a meeting automatically counted as useful work. The value served me well as I got into infrastructure and ops work, but unfortunately, the culture generally supported me. However, I've had to reevaluate that. In my ops roles, I was removed somewhat from general engineering, but still adjacent. In my current role at my current very large company, I am often much further from the everyday work of the colleagues who depend on my team. And recently I've had to step a little further away from automate all the things by acknowledging that sometimes a 30-minute meeting, wherein I don't actually learn anything, can still be a really worthwhile use of time. Because sometimes being a human face of a somewhat forbidding org, reassuring the people I work with outside of my team that we listen and actually have an interest in understanding them, it can be a really good use of 30 minutes. Even without a 3-item agenda, even if the content of the meeting really could have been an email, sometimes reassuring people that they're dealing with someone who cares about their work and shares their goals is a good use of time. My SRE self might be horrified at this, but my present-day self is content. A common finding I have when reviewing vendors for my current role is out-of-date software. Libraries, server versions, languages. We move fast and there's a push and pull between being up-to-date and creating work for ourselves. In Opsland, we clung to the stable thing, only updating certain libraries when we absolutely had to. Is there a vulnerability? Is it creating, say, a server-hindering number of open file descriptors? True story. Cool, let's update. Otherwise, maybe let's talk in 6 months. This is a representation of the burning of the Library of Alexandria, the oldest library I could think of off the top of my head. I am, by the way, well aware that Python is a language and not a library, but I wanted to refer to a fraught update more people are familiar with. I appreciate your indulgence. So my job now is the opposite of this. The finding severity can vary, of course. If it's just a few minor versions out of date, I'll make it informational. You could update this. It might be a good idea to update this sooner, but, you're fine. Is it a major version out of date? Is there a known vulnerability connected to the version that's being used? Looking like a high to critical, my friend. And here's the tough thing. I empathize with both. Managing a constellation of servers interacting with each other in 1,000 different ways is the most delicate balance sometimes. Sure, it's why we have dev environments to tinker with, but even in dev, no one wants to destroy everything. And one of the easiest ways to avoid blowing everything up is to not change anything, unless you really have to, because moving one piece moves another piece until things are just swinging across the entire system. And now my word is one of the reasons that people have to put themselves through that when mostly they just wanted permission to take their internal tool to wider use. If I went back to ops now, I would be a nightmare in this respect. New stable version? Let's update some Ansible files. It's time to go back to the future. But I was right on both ends of the extremes for different reasons. It turns out my philosophy on this changes depending on who's paying me and what goal my team contributes to. So it ends up being a feeling of balance and context, which is more nuanced than I would have once expected to be necessary around something like library version numbers. But it turns out that even something like software versions is a human problem too sometimes. Let's talk about the core skills, though. The non-computer parts. They do exist, and they really do matter. When I interviewed engineers at my last 2 jobs, one of my goals was to push someone to the point where they'd need to admit they didn't know something, just in order to see how they would express that, or if they'd cop to it. I was looking for someone who would openly and even joyfully admit that they didn't know the answer to what I was asking, ideally followed by talking with me about how they would go about fixing that. We didn't want jerks, first of all. And we also didn't want to bring in the toxicity of someone who won't cop to not knowing something, because those folks often aren't fond of admitting when they're wrong either. I would say the equivalent of this is seeing how a security person acts when someone else is wrong. Though we should test for the will they cop to not being omniscient thing too, of course. The best way I know to make a team less effective is to make it punishing for others to give the team the information they need to do their jobs. And that means, I'm afraid, cultivating a poker face with an appearance of light compassion. Practice it at home. Try it out on friends until you don't look terrifying. You'll see. I believe I am paid in part to make sure that people don't feel judged when they talk to me, because alienating the people best equipped to tell me what's going on is a security risk. It's also just how I believe in treating people, but there is a strictly pragmatic benefit to it as well. Being in ops and security, though, does mean that you occasionally learn about really troubling things. Unlovingly made security groups on public-facing servers, frequent reuse of weak passwords for company accounts with prod access, or IAM policies as full of asterisks as a constellation in the sky. Dismay is the correct response to these things and is, I would say, a professional requirement. I don't believe I'm paid to take things in stride if I have the ability to fix them. But the dismay needs to be pointed away from the person who is good enough to tell you about the successful phishing attack targeting their work email, to ensure that they walk away from you knowing that they will tell you the next time such a thing happens. I believe in psychological safety on engineering teams, but this goes beyond that. Basically, between both jobs, having a poker face with a compassionate look to it will get you much more than acidity rejoinders, feigning surprise, or other jerk moves. It takes a considerable amount of energy, but, like I said, that's what they pay me for, and it should be part of what they pay you for, too. Let's take a moment and talk about blame. When you blame a group of people for unavoidable or understandable behavior, you also often end up in the mindset that you're saving them. To start, you are not. We are not. So let's start with that. Don't blame. There's a whole field of thought about blamelessness and process refinement and retros and such that I won't get into. But, with the occasional sharp exception, it is not helpful to blame. And before I left my last job, I set up a Slack bot for Git Blame that showed this. Traditionally, of course, ops and devs disliked each other for this reason. Ops problem now, right? Devs were why they couldn't have nice things. In security, it's a bit broader. Users are why we can't have nice things, right? You can have the most futuristic cryptography, the most immaculately hardened servers, whatever. If there are soft, fallible humans in the mix, you're screwed. But here's the reality. There are no nice things. There's only harm reduction and embracing the chaos. I came around to an approach of causes and effects, which is different in a nuanced way from blame. Things happen. Other things happen in response. There are always causes, there will always be effects. It's just our job to put any possible safeguards in place to prevent whatever bad effects we can, just to steer people toward better actions in the first place. And if you can keep this mindset in both ops and security, you're going to bring something distinctive and useful into a sometimes toxic ecosystem. Related to this, don't act like a martyr. Being a martyr at your job is blame turned to action. I suffer because you did what you did. In ops, it can come out as we have to save devs from themselves. In security, it's sometimes more like we have to save everyone from themselves. When the reality is everyone needs saving sometimes. Computer science is an incredibly large field. Software engineering is just a subset of that, but that is also an incredibly large field. None of us know everything, and if you claim to, I'm going to back away from you as quickly as I can. At some point, all of us will save each other from something, if we're even remotely competent as colleagues. But, unfortunately, we can't be pleasant all the time. And this is something else my SRE job gave me some useful experience in. There it was a little more, please don't use that dodgy third-party library. And now it's a little more, please don't put that random Chrome extension on your browser. How do you perpetually guide people away from their natural behavior while not becoming a complete pariah? In the case of the team I'm on now, it's by being easy to talk to, but bearing the bad news in unassailable process. Hello. It is I, the person who gets paid to veto the neat tool you banged out in Python, or the Chrome extension that would make your job measurably more efficient, and the vendor that does a cool thing with video in a time of everything being remote. Hopefully we live in being the killjoy with some cooperation and also getting to say yes occasionally, because seeking perfection in our work is also an unwinnable game. Here's the thing. Problems are going to happen. The same manager who gave me the advice about automation noticed my dismay at the state of things on an ordinary day with a fairly ordinary number of problems. He told me that in our work, things will always be on fire, if you choose to view them that way. It's a choice to decide to be upset about the imperfect state of things, and it becomes a choice to just be bothered and unhappy all the time. And also that it's sometimes possible to choose not to react this way, to understand that fires are normal, and that our responsibility is to predict and prevent the worst fires, then to throw water on the normal ones when we have some time. But none of these battles would be better for the choice of being angry at ordinary things. In my last job, I had a months-long battle with Elasticsearch and log availability. And sometimes we'd deploy new servers and things wouldn't go so well. I was never pleased about any of this, but I had to choose to act like it wasn't an emergency because these things were just going to happen sometimes. It's inevitable because humans are involved. I'm not going to talk about the computer's parts in this because I know they're listening. I am grateful that my team has a similar philosophy about security. We cannot find every vulnerability. However, we usually can correctly assess security posture, and that's our goal in what we offer to the company. Is the company possessed of a mature security posture? Well, we found a cross-site scripting opportunity on their login page, and after poking some request parameters with Burp Suite, it gave us back a nice sunny look at their database schema, so I'm going to say no. The goal isn't perfection, it's harm reduction, which is attainable most days. A few months ago, I confessed, or at least it felt like I was confessing, to a coworker that I was afraid I was going to ruin our team's stellar reputation with my clumsy newness. I was told, gently and clearly, that security doesn't actually offer an opportunity at perfection. That we, kind of like Saturday Night Live, don't issue reports once we've made them perfect. We issue them when it's time to issue them. That's it. Ops taught me that we aim to get it right the first time, and then if we don't, we do what we need to do to get it there. Bringing that mindset into security, that it isn't perfection we seek, but increased goodness with every act, adding up to something better, made me better at my job. So let's come back to it. What does hiring an infra person for your AppSec team get you? More insight into AWS and other cloud providers than you'd usually expect, sure. Experience with some DevOps tools, so that reviewing them doesn't mean learning what they're for from the ground up. The ability to talk to more teams in greater depth than the team might have been able to before. But honestly, the thing I think I bring that helps us get the most work done is empathy. I know, sorry. At least half of it, though, like this talk, is technical empathy. For your security engineers and team to serve a company full of lots of different kinds of people doing lots of different kinds of jobs, and to do it well and efficiently, you'll do better having more kinds of experience on the team. It is more useful for me to look at a script for checking whether servers are up and know the likely reason why someone stepped wrong than it is just to know that it's wrong. I also follow the model of experience to documentation to script, so if a question comes up a couple of times, I know there's an opportunity to make a bunch of people's lives easier, including mine. Brusque, cloistered security trolls have their place in the industry too. I know and like many of them, but we need balance too to get things done. We do, of course, work in a binary field. It is 0 or 1, beneath all the frameworks and high-level languages and abstractions. And also beyond that, out into the real world. The thing is breached or it isn't. A financial company got popped or it didn't. If you're anything other than the red team, one side of that binary is just unavoidably much larger than the other. It takes a single vulnerability exploited just so, and the flag flips. However, what I love about this work is the massive ambiguity that lives beneath that undeniable binary. The nuance of a company's security posture, the interpretations of an attack surface, the different ways a threat model can be constructed from researching the same situation, and how we treat each other and use each other as resources. I think that there's an interesting application of Pastel's law to be had here. TCP implementation should follow a general principle of robustness. Be conservative in what you do, be liberal in what you accept from others. In both ops and security, I've found it to be most useful to be very precise and clear in what I offer to others, which includes approvals and declines, guidance, and even my affect. All of this is especially true now that none of us are in the same room anymore. There's room to be human, of course, but I've found it serves my goals best to be very consistent on my end when I work with other people. When colleagues talk to me, I want them to be able to reasonably expect someone who will be excited about their challenge, receptive to their ideas, encouraging in their plans, and careful and precise in making recommendations and offering guidance. I want there to be a wide range of acceptable input and a pretty narrow format of what I'll offer in response. When I took the SRE job, I had exactly 0 thoughts about possible future security roles. My focus was on doing the most I could at the job I had, and in a couple of years, I'd reevaluate and see what else I wanted from my work life. Fortunately, in doing that, I ended up learning things that did in fact make me a more useful AppSec engineer, and I hope my experiences lent you something useful too. This was genuinely a pleasure. Thank you so much for listening.